Hey chaps, I hope you're all well. Today we're going to be looking at creating some extensible tooling for our editor. That might sound a little bit boring, to be fair, and I totally appreciate that. But this is an important step we need to take before we can implement our next tool, which will be our object placing tool. So we can place things like player spawn points, enemies, etc. This is an important step for us to be able to do that. So, this is going to be a two-part episode, the first part being today, the second part being next Monday, and expect more over the following Mondays as well. I'm really looking forward to getting into it, so let's just dive straight in, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. Let's launch our editor and talk a bit about what it is we plan to tackle first. So with the next major functionality in the editor, being able to place objects, and objects may comprise of things like player spawn points, enemy spawn points, items, chests, whether that's traversals to other maps, etc. All these interactive things will form under the umbrella of an object. Now the immediate first thought you might have is placing another radio button underneath here, and that's probably the easiest thing to do. But in hindsight, that actually longer term becomes more difficult because we have a bunch of things down this sidebar here relating to things like tiles, which we don't want to look at. We want to look at objects when we selected paint objects. And there's just a general load of nastiness over here that's just going to take up a lot more vertical space, and we're going to run out of room anyway. So it makes more sense to move these into somewhere more permanent and extendable. And we're going to do that by moving these buttons into a tool strip menu, which I'm going to show you first of all. So our first piece of work is migrating this functionality up to a tool strip menu. So let's close down the editor. We're going to go to our editor project over here, right click on Form 1 CS and View Designer. Okay, so in our toolbox on the left here, we're going to look for a tool strip right here, and we're just going to click anywhere in the form. That will automatically place the tool strip at the top of the window. Okay, so with our tool strip, we can then click this drop down here, and we can add a variety of different components to that tool strip. So what we really want here is a bunch of buttons which will represent our various tools that we can use. So we want one for painting tiles and one for painting collision. Okay, so the way radio buttons work is obviously you can only have one selected at a time. But out of the box, we don't get that behavior in these tool strip menu buttons. So if I had two buttons, 1, 2. In the properties menu down here, we do have some options here for checking them. We also have an ability here for making the button change its check status on being clicked. So we'll change this to true, and then change that on the other button as well. And launch the editor. Okay, and I click on them, and you can see they have like a toggled state to them. They've got a border, and the same if I click on this one, it'll do the same. But I don't want it to work like that. I want it to work in a way such that if I click on one, it'll deselect the other and highlight the one that I've clicked, so I can have one tool active at a time. So radio behaviors do not exist out of the box on a tool strip menu button, so we have to implement that ourselves. So let's go ahead and do that now. It's actually pretty straightforward. So in the controls folder of our game editor project, I'm going to right click, add new item. I'm going to create a class. And I'm going to call this tool strip radio button, or CS. Okay, so here's my class for my radio button. I'm now going to extend tool strip button. I might need to add the using statement for this, so control period, and using system Windows forms. Okay, so here's my very, very basic tool strip radio button. He's no different right now to an existing type of button. But if we give this a build, okay, go to my form designer. How do I get that button to appear in here? Well, let's go back to our class. We need to use an attribute called tool strip item designer availability. Control period for that one, and then using system Windows forms design. Okay. And then we give this for the constructor, which accepts a tool strip item designer availability. We're going to give that tool strip item designer availability dot, and we're going to make this tool strip. Okay, and let's just make sure that it appears in the tool strip menu and not a normal menu strip. Let's give that a build. Go back to the designer. Click the drop down. you'll see it's still actually not yet appeared. If I close the designer and reopen it, that makes no difference either, and that's because it needs to be public. So if I go back to my class that I just created, I make this public, give that a build, go back to my designer, and I click the drop down here, and you'll see I have radio button as an option. And you'll see it just says radio button as well. That's because it completely strips out the word toolstrip from the name of the class and just gives you radio button. So if you remember a moment ago when we created our toolstrip buttons, we set the property check on click to true. We're going to set that to true at all times on this button as default because that's how we want the radio buttons to work. So I'm going to create a constructor for my toolstrip radio button. Toolstrip radio button. Spell. Okay, and I'm just going to set check on click. Oh my god, I'm struggling to spell today. There we go. Check on click true. Okay, and that just means by default that check on click functionality will always be enabled. Okay, so what do we then need to do to make this behave like a radio button? So much like a radio button, it has a handler for when the checked status of the button changes. So we can override that to do some things of our own. In this particular case, what I'm going to do is change it so that when this radio button is clicked, all other radio buttons of this type in the toolstrip menu will have their checked status changed to false. So much like a radio button, this type of button has a handler that we can override to perform some behavior of our own when the checked status of this button changes. So what we can do is when one of these buttons changes to checked true, we can set all other buttons of this type to checked false to ensure that only one of them can ever be checked true. Okay, so to do that, we're going to create an override. So override space, and then we're going to override on checked changed. We're going to remove that base call, and then we're going to do some of our own functionality now. So let's take the perspective of being the button that is being clicked, and therefore we want to make all the others to be unchecked. So if we are the button, we know our checked status is changing to true. Okay. The next thing we need to do is get all the other buttons of this type in the toolstrip. So we can do that by just creating a list of toolstrip radio button. And we'll just call this other radio buttons. And then we just get the parent. We get the parent's items. And then we can use a link query of type. And then we can do a query for all items of type toolstrip radio button. Okay. But then we want to narrow down that query a little bit more so that it excludes ourselves, because we don't want to select us again and then set our check to false and the circle will just keep going around. So we want to make sure that we exclude ourselves. So we select all parent items of type toolstrip radio button where, and then we insert a lambda call here, so where are. So this is basically saying this will run for each particular item in that list and allow you to filter out the ones that you don't want. So where R is different to this. And then we'll just list that to make sure it will go into our list here. Okay. So at this point, we've got all the other radio buttons in the tool strip. The only thing we then need to do is just go through that list of radio buttons and set their checked value to false. So since we're doing some funky link and lambda queries here, I'm just going to continue that trend and do something similar for the for each as well, just to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to call other radio buttons dot for each, and I'll just assign this to R again. The curly brackets, and I'm just going to go R dot checked equals false. Miss my semicolon. Okay, and I think that's all we're going to need. So if we just give that a quick build, make sure that build's okay. Go back to our designer. We'll get rid of these two buttons we created earlier on. Delete those. And then we'll create two of our own custom radio buttons. In fact, let's make 3. Okay, let's give that a run. Okay, so let's select one of the radio buttons. Select the first one. Select the middle one. And you can see that it's deselecting the others when I click one of them. And that's working pretty much as I would like it to work. So what we can do now effectively is remove this group box and the 2 radio buttons entirely and start relying on our toolstrip buttons up here. So what we're going to do is delete our third button, as we only need 2. And then I'm going to delete the radio group box entirely and start porting that functionality over to our 2 tool strip buttons. So let's delete the group box. And I'm going to give these buttons a name as well, just so I can refer to them correctly. So the first one, I'm going to select that. Go into the properties of my button, and I'm just going to call this tool strip paint tiles. The second one, I'm going to click that and call this tool strip paint collision. Simple as that. So much like any other click handler in Windows Forms, all we have to do is double click on these buttons to create a handler in the form class. So for the first one, let's double click that. Go back to Form 1 Designer, double click the second one. And then we've got our 2 event handlers for clicking those 2 buttons. But if we scroll up, right where our radio button handlers existed before, they're now failing because they're trying to refer to the previously existing radio buttons. So we can just port this functionality over to our new handlers at the bottom. So let's select this, move that down, paste it in here. So we're moving our radio paint tiles checked functionality into our tool strip paint tiles click functionality. But because we know it's being clicked, we don't need to check if it's checked anymore. So let's remove that and leave that as so, and then we'll just do something similar for the tool strip paint collision handler. So MonoGame editor 1 mode equals paint mode dot collision, and then we can remove those 2 event handlers entirely. Alright, so with that done, I'm going to launch the editor and make sure everything is still working. So you'll see here straight away, none of them are selected, but if I pick a tile from the tileset selector, I can place tiles, which gives the impression, which is actually the case, that the tile selector mode is enabled. So what I need to do is enable the check status of this button by default when the editor runs. So let's close that down real quick, go back to the designer, select the first button, and I'm just going to change the checked status of that first button to true. Give that a run again. And boom, here you'll see we have been given an exception. Now the reason we're getting this exception is because the way the designer works, it is trying to run this code as soon as it creates the component before it's placed onto the form. Therefore, parent in this case is actually null. And that's all just because we tried setting the default value of checked to true. So we need to account for this particular scenario in our code. And that's pretty straightforward. All we really need to do is just have a check for null on the parent here and return if it is null. So if parent equals null, then we'll just return out. Let's give that a run one more time. Now you'll see we've got no error and our first button is checked to indicate that we are in tile paint mode. So I can select my tile and begin painting as normal. So with that done, the next thing we really need to tackle is consolidating our code responsible for the tools themselves. Now the way it works right now, if we go back to Form 1 CS, in the clicking of the tool buttons, it just sets an enum, and then responding to that enum in the MonoGame editor class, if I right click him and view code, in the update method for the MonoGame editor, it has a load of ifs, else ifs, etc. based on the mode you are in, and then performs some logic. But this is really deeply ingrained in the editor itself, and it'd be nice to extract this out into a tool class for each tool so that we can add another one for placing objects relatively easily. So let's just go ahead and smash that bad boy out of the park. I mean, it makes sense to do it now before we get to the next tool, so we know it'll be easier to add the next one when we get to it in the next couple of episodes. So as a baseline, what do our tools need to know about to be able to function correctly? Well, we know right now when you have selected a tile brush and the tile position is in a valid position, it will add an immediate tile to the map to give you that hover tile effect. So there's 2 things right away there that we need off the bat, and that is the map and the tile position. Additionally, when you are trying to make a change to the collision layer, we need to know the cell position as well and the keyboard state. There's 4 things there at minimum that we need for our tools to be able to function correctly. So what we're going to do is we're going to our editor project over here. We're going to create a new folder for our tools. So right click on the editor project, add new folder, and we'll call this tools. So this folder is going to hold all of our tooling classes, but first of all we need to create a common tool class. So I'm going to right click on that tools folder, add new item, and we'll call this painting tool .cs. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to make this abstract because we want all of our tools to extend from this. So we'll just create an abstract class painting tool, and from here we'll have all the common functionality across each of our tools. So what are the common themes across our tools? Well, we know we need to hover and we know we need to paint, but also we need to know if it is a valid position. So we're going to create 3 different methods to address these different needs. We create a public abstract bool for checking if it is a valid position for this tool. Secondly, we're going to create a public abstract void for what happens when you hover. And then finally, we're going to create a public abstract void for what happens when you paint. So that is the click functionality. Now remember, we have different pieces of information that each of our tools need. If you recall what they are, if we go to the editor, they are a map for adding the hover tile. They are a tile position for checking if the tile paint is in a valid position. Likewise, the same for the cell position for when you are changing the collision layer. But also the very special case for when you are changing the collision layer, we need to know if the control key is down on the keyboard, so we know whether to add or remove a collision cell. So back to our painting tool base class, we need to pass in those pieces of information to these methods so each of our tools can then make use of them. So the first one is going to be the map. So we'll just call this map. Add a using for that, control period, using the game engine.tilemaps. The second one will be the keyboard state extended, keyboard state, add the using for that, control period, using MonoGame extended input. And then we'll pass in the tile and cell position as well. So tile layer dot tile position detail, we'll just call that tile position, and then cell layer, to remind myself, back to the editor. Collision layer dot cell position detail. That's what I want. Copy that, paste that in here, and we'll just call that cell position. Okay, so there we have our 4 pieces of information. Now we'll copy this method signature to each of the others as well. So we'll copy that into hover, and we'll copy that into paint as well. So let's now create our tools that can then use this behavior. So first of all, let's right click on the tools folder, add new item, and the first one we'll do is we'll create the tile painting tool .cs. Okay, so this is going to extend our painting tool, which will then mean we need to implement the 3 abstract methods. So if we control period on here, implement abstract class, and then we can add the usage of these methods as we see fit. So first of all, for hovering on the tile painting tool, if we go back to our editor, what our editor does is it adds the immediate tile based on the brush tile. So there is a very special case for the tile painting tool where it needs to know about a brush tile. So let's copy that functionality from the editor whilst we're here. So let's copy this property and we'll place that in our tile painting tool. Okay, so that's our brush tile, which we'll set from somewhere else in a moment. Okay, so back to the editor again. How we add the hover tile is we call add immediate tile on the map, obviously depending if the brush tile is different to null. Now, interestingly, this actually leads to a problem currently, whereby if we select a tile and then move to painting collision, we'll then see a tile hovered around the tile map even though we're not painting tiles. That's because of this piece of logic here. It does not check what tool you are using. The beauty of us moving to these tools is we can add this brush different to null check in the is valid position check at the same time. So what we can do whilst we're here is we'll go back to the tile painting tool. We'll implement the is valid position first, just so we have that done and out of the way. And to check if it is valid position for the tile painting tool, what we're going to do is return tile position dot is valid position, and we'll also check if the brush tile is different to null. So once we've done implementing this, it will get no further than this and not hit hover or click if the brush tile is not selected, which is what we'd like. Okay, so now back to the MonoGame editor class. What we're going to do is we're going to copy this code here, and we're going to paste that into the hover method of our tile painting tool. So let's rename these variables where appropriate. So my map becomes map, tile position detail becomes tile position. And that's it for the hover method. That will now work as it did previously, obviously when we have invoked it. We have not yet got to that stage. The last step for the tile painting tool is how we paint. Okay, so if we go back to our MonoGame editor class here and find out how we actually paint onto the map, what we do is we set the tileset index to the brush tile tileset index, and the same with the tile index as well. So let's copy this code and put this in our paint method. Now, where does tile come from? So just a brief reminder on that one. If we go back to our editor, tile comes from the tile position detail. So all we need to do to change that code in our painting tool is just type before tile. Actually, let's change tile. Let's change this to tile position dot tile, and the same for the next line as well, if I spell that correctly. Okay, so for the next line, tile position dot tile. And that's it for our paint tool. So now we need to do the same thing, but for our collision painting tool. So let's create a new class under the tools folder, right click, add new item, and we'll create the collision painting tool .cs. Okay, so similar to last time, we're going to extend our painting tool, and we're going to control period, implement abstract class. So going back to the editor, just to remind ourselves what happens with the collision tool on hover. Well, it doesn't do anything at all. So what we're going to do is going back to the collision painting tool, we're just going to remove this exception and do nothing for the time being. So the isValidPosition method, very much the same as the tile position method. So the tile painting tool, what we do is we check to see if the tile position is valid. For the collision layer tool, we're going to check if the cell position is valid. So return cell position is valid position. So paint is a little bit different for the collision painting tool. Going back to the editor class again, what we do is we check to see if the control key is down. If it is, we update the cell to be collidable false, and conversely, if it is not down, we update it to be collidable true. So just to replicate that behavior in our new tool, we're going to copy and paste this bunch of code here back to our collision painting tool. And in our paint method, we're going to paste that in here. So now let's rename our variables to match up with our new method. So my map becomes map, and cell position detail just becomes cell position. And there we go, that's it for that one. So the last thing we need to do to get this functional in one foul swoop is we're going to completely remove that paint mode enum, and we're going to implement our new painting tools. So back in the editor class, what we're going to do is we're going to scroll to the bottom of this class and delete this paint mode enum and deal with the errors as a result. So we can actually just completely remove this as a behavior and now start relying on our painting tools. So let's remove that and then give it a build and see what sort of errors we have to deal with. There's probably going to be a fair few, so let's just crack on with those. Okay, so the first thing we get in the MonoGame editor is, of course, we're expecting a paint mode to be passed into the editor itself, which now, of course, we want to replace with the paint tools themselves. Okay, so what we're going to do is going to remove this paint mode, and we're going to replace this with a public painting tool, active painting tool, and that'll be a get set, much like it was before. Then it's add the missing using statements, so control period, using the game editor.tools. So now we're passing that in, or we will soon be passing that in instead of the paint mode. So scrolling down now, the next thing we're going to have to deal with is the errors within our update method. So all we have to do here is fairly simply remove all this code and start taking into account our new active painting tool. Let's just remove all of this and start afresh. So if we have an active painting tool, it's different to null, then we need to start taking into account our specific painting tool behaviors. So first of all, the first question we need to ask is, well, is this a valid position for this tool? So if active painting tool, what is valid position, and pass in the various pieces of information we need. So my map, keyboard state, tile position detail, and cell position detail. Okay, so at this point we know we have a valid position for the tool that is active. Next, we need to work out if the mouse button is down. So if mouse state dot is button down, and then want the left button, then we need to invoke, okay, cool, active painting tool, begin the paint, because the left button is down. So pass in the same information again, my map, keyboard state, tile position detail, and cell position detail. Copy that line because we're going to need it in a second for when we are just hovering. So if we're not holding down the left key, the left mouse button, but we're in a valid position, then it's likely we are hovering. So instead of calling paint, let's call hover. And that's pretty much it for this class. So next up, let's go tackle the plethora of errors in our Form 1 class. So let's double click on our first one and see which one that is. So pretty much as I expected to see, it's complaining that the mode property no longer exists because we want to start replacing this with our tools. So let's create a couple of instances of the tools that we need. So let's scroll to the top of our Form 1 class and let's create a couple of variables to house them. So I'm going to create a private tile painting tool. We need to add the using control period using the game editor dot tools. I'll just call this tile painting tool. And then we'll have the same thing again for the collision painting tool. Alright, and then we need to instantiate those. We'll put them after our initialized component. So tile painting tool equals new tile painting tool, and the same for the collision painting tool. Alright, so we've got our tools there and instantiated. The next thing we need to do is actually set the active tool based on the selection. So scrolling to the bottom of our Form 1 class, where our two existing handlers are for setting the mode, we are now going to set the active painting tool to the relevant tool itself. So MonoGame editor1.mode now becomes MonoGame editor1.active painting tool, and in the case of this handler for painting tiles, the active painting tool becomes the painting tile tool, or the tile painting tool. That was the name of the variable. Forgot for a second. And then similarly for the tool strip paint collision, we want to set the active painting tool to the the collision painting tool. Okay, so now we're setting the tools appropriately. The next error in the list, if we double click on him, let's have a look. So this is just in the generated code by the designer where we set a default mode to tiles. Let's just remove that now. Okay, close down the designer. And then that leaves us with no errors, I believe. Let's give it a build. There's one thing we do need to remove actually, just to force out any more errors in the editor class. If we scroll to the top, let's remove the brush tile because we're now going to set the brush tile on the tool when it is active. Let's give that a build. That'll lure out any more errors. There we go. Let's click this error. So the first error for me in this case is in the tileset previewer tile select method, where we're trying to set the MonoGame Editor 1 brush tile. Now no longer we need to set the brush tile in the editor, we need to set it in the tool itself. So this is going to become the tile painting tool dot brush tile equals brush tile. Lowercase. There we go. Okay, that's that one. Let's give it a build again and see if there's any more errors. And again, similar to before, it's trying to set a default value to null, so let's remove that from the Form 1 Designer CS. Okay, give that a build once more. Okay, so it looks like we've got no more errors. Let's give this a run and see if we have behavior as expected like before. Okay, so let's select a tile set, a full tile set, select a tile. We're currently on our tile tool here, so nothing is happening. I wonder if that's because I've not clicked it. Yes, it is. But if I click on this one, the tile disappears. Click on it again, the tile hovers. So that's fixed the existing issue. So the modes are working, except off the bat, when I load it up, even though it's selected this by default, it's not actually selected the tile painting tool. Now, the reason for that is because in our Form 1 CS, remember, in our handlers at the bottom of the file, we only set the paint tool based on a click. Now, although we are setting the default checked value to true, we're not actually invoking this click method. So, what can we do to fix that? What we can do relatively straightforwardly, there are various ways you can get around this. However, just to get us over the bump in the road here, all I'm going to do in the constructor here is just set our MonoGame editor 1.active painting tool to the tile painting tool. Alright, let's hit start on the editor here. And now with our default tool selected, I've not clicked anything. Let's select a tile. And then you can see I can paint tiles as expected. Select our collision tool, nothing happens. Let's see if I select the collision layer, if I can paint my collision as expected. Yep. So now we're back to how it was before, albeit with some more extensible functionality that we can easily add more tools with. And that wraps up the first part of this episode, chaps. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave a like, a comment, and or subscribe. And tune in next Monday for the second part of this episode, to which we can then wrap up and steam forward towards dropping in objects such as player spawn points, enemies, chests, other things like traversing multiple maps, etc. The options really are unlimited once we have placed our next tool into the editor, because we can then interact with more things in the game world. And really, it's just going to get a lot more interesting and exciting from this point forward. However, I do think these sorts of things are important because they highlight how much work there is involved with implementing a game and its relevant tooling. There should be no illusions as to how much work has to be put into creating an RPG, and I think this really sends that point home with how much is involved with creating something from scratch. But I do hope you've been enjoying it up till now, and I look forward to progressing it over the coming weeks and months. Well, cheers chaps, and I hope you tune into the next one, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.